Okay, so just wanted to make sure that everybody was on. If you can hear me, if you could write something in the chat room just so that we know that you're here, and then we're going to get started in about a minute or so. Just checking that you can hear us. If you can hear us, just put something into the chat room. Yes, we hear you loud and clear. Awesome. It's good to know. Okay, with that, knowing that everybody is now online and you can hear us very well, I think we should get started. So I am super excited for today's webinar because we're going to be talking with one of my favorite people in the testing world, gentleman Dan Ashby, who's the head of quality engineering at Photobox. Now, for those that don't know about Dan or myself, let me just give you a super quick background. So I'm your host, Ronald Cummings-John, and I'm the co-founder of Global App Testing, and also spent the last 2 to 3 years writing a book about leading quality because we were fascinated with how do the top people in the world lead quality inside their organizations. So we interviewed people from companies like Etsy, GitHub, Spotify, Airbnb, Reddit, to understand how are they looking at quality inside their companies. And while we were going through this process of writing the book, we were basically trying to answer a question around automation versus human or manual testing. How should you look at it? Because there are many times that I walk into rooms and people talk very much that, and they say that, hey, we should automate everything. And then I'm in other rooms and people are like, no, you can't automate everything. And in actual fact, automation doesn't even work because it's so flaky. And there's always this debate over what we should do. And so while I was in the process of reading around this subject, I came across an article called Continuous Testing in DevOps. And I remember it so distinctly because I was actually on a plane about to take off. And I just finished reading this article by Dan Ashby. And I texted a friend of mine called Vernon Richards and I said, Vernon, have you ever heard of this guy called Dan Ashby? Because I've just read his article and it's fascinating. I'd love to meet him. And Vernon said, yeah, I know him. I'm in front of him right now. And I was just thinking to myself, what are the chances of that happening? And so Vernon ended up making an intro to Dan. And a week later, Dan was on a VoIP call with me. And he ended up laying out for me a model of thinking around automation versus human testing. And when we put it inside the book, I've had so much feedback from people saying that the way how it was described was so well put together that it was the first time that other people inside their company understood really the benefits of the two and when to use each of them. And so what we're going to do in today's webinar is we're going to be sharing with you that whole model and that whole way of looking at the world. And Dan's going to take us through some of his diagrams and drawings to do that. But before we get into all of that, I think we should have Dan introduce himself so you know just a little bit more about him. So, Dan, please.
Cool. So firstly, thanks for having me on this webinar. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm Dan. Currently, I'm the head of quality engineering at Photobox, based in London. Previously worked at companies like eBay as head of testing, AstraZeneca as global head of quality. So I've worked in leadership roles for a while. My current role is kind of more around strategy and coaching and mentoring and teaching about testing and quality and how to improve within Photobox. I'm also the co-host of a Testing in a Pub podcast. Check it out if you haven't already. We've not posted in a while, but some really interesting chats with a chap called Steve Janaway. And also co-founder of a meetup group called the Software Testing Clinic. we're rebranding next year, so look out for that. We're currently across many cities in the UK, and it's basically a free space for people to come along and learn about various topics within testing, and also a safe space to get into mentoring if you're ready to take that step as well. Check out my website. Check out that continuous testing and DevOps blog as well.
Awesome. So before we get into the model, I can never talk about this subject without talking about conspiracy theories.
Yep.
I just can't help it. And the main reason why is because as we were looking at a lot of the ways that people look and think about things in the world, there was a gentleman called Edward Bernays that I found out about. Now, most people haven't heard of Edward Bernays, right? Most people have heard of someone called Sigmund Freud, Dr. Sigmund Freud, because he's the psychologist that we know about. Now, the only reason that all of us know about Sigmund Freud is because of this guy, Edward Bernays. Because Edward Bernays' job was he was part of the American propaganda campaign. And in actual fact, the term PR, he created the term PR. Before that, it was just propaganda. And he changed it to public relations, right? And what Edmund Bernays ended up doing is he ended up looking at different ways to influence people's thinkings. And how do you get people thinking in certain ways, following certain trends of thoughts? And one of the concepts that he came up with was this idea called choice architects. And a choice architect is an entity or a person that presents ideas in a way that moves your choices and your thinking into a certain direction. And so there I was understanding all about these conspiracy theories. And I began to look at our industry, the testing industry. And I asked myself, who or what are the choice architects that lead us to think about certain things in this space? And when I look at automation and the sort of polar ideas that sit around it, I was like, who are the choice architects in our industry? And it occurred to me that it was pretty much the testing vendors to a certain degree, and almost the desire that a lot of the companies had to do certain forms of testing. And so as testing vendors, like the automation specialists, we would talk about things from a marketing perspective that would really hamper on the fact that, hey, you can automate everything if you use our tool, right? Mm-hmm. And that way of thinking started to make people go, wow, do you know what? If I look at the problems I have inside my org, if we could do that, that would be incredible. And then these rumors started to appear, or the thinking was that, hey, it is possible to automate everything. Mm-hmm. And then as I was talking to you about this, you started to talk about other ideas like the Dunning-Kruger effect. And I'd love you to just explain a little bit about that.
Yeah, so firstly on choice architects, it's everywhere, right?
I
even used this in my kid, thinking about it. Right? So I've got a 2-year-old son, and even like eating dinner, right? You influence the choice. You still act as if it's autonomy, right? But for example, I say, look, do you want to eat your peas or your carrots, right? My goal is to just make him eat some kind of vegetable, right? But I'm putting a choice in front of him, so he feels as if he has some level of autonomy. Mm-hmm. I'm going to choose my peas, you know? And then that way I'm just like, yes, win. But architecting, I'm influencing what he's eating there, right? Yeah. Through choice architects. That's the way that I see that. But Dunning-Kruger it's different, but it still applies here in terms of automation as well. It's kind of, there's two sides to Dunning-Kruger. The main side is where people, an example would be people read 1 or 2 blog posts about something, and then they've gained some knowledge and they think that they are more of an expert than what they actually are. They think they know the subject now because I've read a blog or 2 about it. It's so common. It happens to everyone. Cognitive bias. The flip side of it is you actually learn so much about a subject that you know that there's so much more to learn about the subject. So you can never call yourself an expert because you know that there's so much that you don't know, right? Yeah. So that's kind of the Dunning-Kruger effect in a nutshell, really. Cognitive bias is well worth checking out. It affects everyone, right? So with automation, there are a lot of people that will get this information from tool vendors and not expand on that information, not actively learn more and just take that as truth, right? Yep. So therefore they'll be saying, well, I heard this from 3 different vendors, it must be true, right? Mm-hmm. and now I know all about the subject, right?
And I think so. So when you start to look at, why do we automate? There are a few reasons, right? So why companies turn to automation? So one of those becomes that need for speed, right? People want to develop their products as fast as possible, and by focusing on forms of automation, which practically allow you to do things in a shorter period of time, it will help you with that speed. And then the aim is that, well, if you can have that happening faster, you free up more time, or with that free time, you can have your teams doing other high value activities. So that is, I guess, one of the reasons why it becomes interesting.
Yeah, certainly you can run your checks. Some people call them checks, right, or tests. Ultimately, you're setting an expectation, right? So you can run them faster if they're automated. You can click a button and run. You don't have to actually run through steps personally. But I mean, there's still an aspect of creating the scripts and maintaining the scripts, which take time. So need for speed, if you think about that applying to just running those assertions that you've got.
Right. Yeah. And I think oftentimes when people look at it, that's all they're looking at.
Yeah.
They think that automation is just the running part, and they forget the pre and post work that has to happen around it, right?
Yeah.
The other reason why people often look at automation is because of, hey, from a budget and resource perspective, if you can perform the same or a larger scale of testing or checking, which we'll come into the details of it later, but with the same level of resources, hey, that sounds great. There's so much more that you get to utilize your resources for. And then also, if you can expand your capabilities at a fraction of the cost, and that's whether that's time or financially, hey, there's a huge benefit that sits there, right? Yeah,
and this is certainly true with a lot of open source automation tools now, right? You're getting an automation tool for free these days, right? And a lot of companies do have that belief that you can automate everything, so therefore they're getting a free automation tool, and developers are really good at writing code, so they can write automation scripts. So a lot of companies are looking at this as a way to save money in terms of removing the role of a tester within a team, right? But I mean, we'll talk about a bit in this webinar about how I believe that that's a big misconception. So.
Okay. The other reason is this whole idea of maintaining consistency, right? Computers are very accurate. They execute things in the exact same way every time, as opposed to sometimes, hey, we make human errors, manual error choices, right? And then this idea that, hey, it can stop you from introducing bugs into the process itself. Once again, because anything that's human has a level of human issues that it may interject into its process. And then it's also repeatable, and you can just keep on doing it with the same outcome every time.
Yeah, there's massive benefits for automation, right? The fact that you can repeatedly check something the same way every time is huge for things like testing for regression risks, right? Yeah. You will have that need for looking for certain types of risks, right? Looking at certain types of risks. However, it can also be a big problem in the sense of it's only checking for the things that it's coded to check the same way every time, so it's not going to look at anything else.
And I think that's pretty much like the next bit of this, right? Yeah. Which is that, hey, is it too good to be true? Does it do everything? And what is the true price of automation has to be considered? Because like we're saying, it's not just this executing a part. There's a planning, there's preparing, there's sustaining and maintaining those efforts. And so what I would love us to share with everyone is, when you first sat down with me, you were drawing on the virtual screen in front of me. You were just going frantically at it, right? And there were two questions that I felt you really answered incredibly well. The first question was, can you automate everything? Like, is it actually possible to automate everything? And then the second question that you answered was, should you automate everything, even if you could automate the thing? And so I want to start off with that first question. The question of, can you automate everything? And I'm going to hand over to you to start talking to us about your ideas around information and investigating. Let's go.
Cool. So my immediate answer to this is no, right? But with the caveat that automation is essential, right? You need both automation and this sort of, we're calling in this manual testing, but that's a bit of a contentious term. It's more like the human side of testing, right? The investigation. So there's the model that you've got in the book. Thanks for adding that to the book, by the way. Total imposter syndrome. But yeah, this model revolves around about information. And there's kind of 4 different categories. The way that I see information, there's 4 kind of categories here, which I'm breaking into quadrants here. So the top right is explicit information, right? This is our things, expectations that we set, right? We make explicit, we write in our requirements or specifications or user stories or acceptance criteria. It's all the stuff that we anticipate and how the software should work. We're setting that expectation and making it explicit somehow to help with design and development, right? But that's all visible knowledge, but there's invisible knowledge as well in terms of tacit and implicit information. So this is the stuff that tacit is stuff that you can't make explicit, and implicit information is the stuff that you haven't, but you might be able to. But that could be conscious or subconscious decision to not make it explicit, right? More than likely it's subconscious, right? But that's knowledge that we've got. But on the flip side of that, we've got this level of ignorance. It's the science of ignorance here, right? So it's related to our unknowns. And again, there's visible ignorance in terms of unknowns that we're aware of. And then there's invisible ignorance, which is unknowns that we're unaware of, right? So if you think about these 4 quadrants, then we can break that information box into what can be automated in terms of those expectations, that explicit expectation that we've got. That's ultimately the stuff that we can automate. We can put checks around once we've built some software to assert whether the software meets that expectation. But then for all those other 3 quadrants, you don't have an expectation that's explicit, right? You've got something that's implicit, or you've got an unknown that you're aware of that you have to put investigation into. And if you think about this in terms of product risks, software product risks, there's a lot of risks that you'll be aware of that you don't have an expectation for, that you'll need to investigate because you're trying to identify information about the software related to those risks, not necessarily just about those expectations. There's another distinction here in terms of how we view quality as well, right? There's the quality as correctness. Does it do what it's expected to? Yeah. And that's where automation really relates to. But then there's also the quality as goodness. Like how good is your software? Not how correct is it, how good is it? Do people enjoy using it? Like are people delighted by your software? You can't use automation for that. And that's something that you've got to investigate. You've got to explore. You use exploratory testing to uncover that kind of information. And that's where there's a huge movement within the testing industry. There has been for some time, but it's actually, in my opinion, really picking up this past few years. And I think it's going to be the future, is that there's this huge drive towards the exploratory testing side of things.
Yeah, we keep on saying that in order to get the best level of testing, you actually need a blended or a hybrid approach.
Yeah.
And I think about all the people that we met as we were going through this whole process. The top people that I've known and met in this industry, they have all said the same thing. Like, it is this blended approach. They're using multiple different tools and services to get to the quality level that they want, because they all give them different types of information that they then have to work out and assess how they're going to use.
Yeah. And I mean, this is coming back to, it has to be a blended approach. It's a yin and a yang, right? Mm-hmm. We need technology to help enhance how we're building technology. And speed is important, right? The margins of business, being first to market, is really important, right? So we need to use tools to enhance how we're building and testing software, and we need to use tools to assist with that exploration as well, right? But the thing is, based on that information model, tools alone aren't going to build you a high quality software, right? It's the thinking, it's the people side, and it's a lot of people forget that people build software for people, right? So there's a huge human aspect to that as well. Like even from that creative, I've mentioned in the word creativity here, but even from that creative lens, it's all about your thinking skills. It's all about your investigation skills. And do you have the right idea for a solution to solve the problem that you're thinking about, right?
Yeah.
How do you test the quality of your idea, right? Mm-hmm. And this correctness and goodness, it's really bizarre because building software is the only thing that a lot of teams think this. They think that quality is correctness, right? If you, it's a common thing. If you ask people what does quality mean in your team, they say, well, the software is working as expected, right? But building software is the only thing that we actually think this for. For everything else, quality is goodness. And we were chatting earlier, and I used your shoes as an example, right? It's the quality of your shoes. You don't think, oh, are my shoes correct? You think, well, how good are they? Like, are they comfortable? Do I like the design? How good is the design? Are they worn? Do I need to get a new pair? You know, you're thinking about your relationship with the shoes in terms of how much you like them and how good they are for you, what you value, right?
Totally.
And it's the same if you use anyone else's software, right? You're thinking about the software, even implicitly about how good it is to use.
And how good it is to use for you. You know, one of the things that we talk about in Leading Quality book is this concept of local personas. Yep. Which is really saying how, yes, you know, the marketing and product teams may create personas for your product, but those are very broad, generalized views of who could use your product. Yeah. But when it comes to from an engineering and a quality side, the person who picks up that application or who logs onto that website, they expect it to work perfectly for them, no matter what location, device, operating system they're on personally. And so that whole it working for me is such a strong part of a view of quality. And it also gets you thinking more about the customer than your company in terms of where your focus is. Your focus ends up being a lot more customer centric when you have that kind of view.
Yeah.
But I just want to jump onto the second question that you ended up asking, because that gives us a very clear view of, you know, can you automate everything? And the answer being no, there are things that you can and things that you can't. And they both have their benefit because they give you different types of information, etc. But let's say the things that you can automate, right? Because that is there. What becomes the views around should you automate the things that you can even automate?
So there's a big question on value, right? Do you need the consistency that automation would bring? Do you need the repeatability for running those checks every time against those expectations? There's big questions there. I think this is where in the model we've represented this with the ones and zeros represent the tool, the automation itself, and then the person represents the human side of verifying those expectations, right? So there's those questions around whether you need to automate and then the costs associated with writing those scripts for that repeatability versus if you don't need the repeatability, then it's probably more cost effective to have the human a certain side of that. Equally, there's a balance here between what I was saying earlier about explicit versus implicit and tacit knowledge, right? If something's explicit, then it's easier to write steps around how to assert that expectation. But if something's implicit, then it's harder to actually create automation around that in the sense of it's invisible knowledge. It's coming back to those quadrants, right? So it's much harder to do. You're inevitably, if a tester is looking at software, even if they have test cases and are running through steps, they'll always read between the lines, right? Step 97, click the save button, but there's different ways to click the save button. There's the mouse, or you can tab onto it and hit the enter key, right? Or there might be multiple save buttons in the form.
So much variations that happens when you have a person going through.
Right? Yeah. So you might still be asserting that expectation, but if you're writing an automated script to click the save button, then it's going to click it the same way every time. You're probably not going to take into account the different ways that you can click the same button.
And all the other things that might be happening on that journey that actually are problems and bugs. But unless you have you still need that human element to sometimes see some of those things along that journey.
Yeah, and with automation, it is very algorithmic. And although test cases are designed to be algorithmic, the human element of that, you're always going to detect other stuff along the way. Right? Other variables. You're always going to, and a lot of that. I think one of the reasons that there is a big misconception about automating everything is because a lot of that stuff that a tester does, if they are using test cases, it goes undocumented. They don't share that testing story, that side of the testing story. Generally, what's shared is the pass or fail from the test case, right?
So all that work is hidden, right? No one even knows it exists. But thinking about this question, then it was when we were looking into this, we found a study done by IBM, and they were trying to calculate how do you know more, like statistically, when you should automate things versus when you shouldn't. And it actually is a whole lot of formulas, but we simplified it to these 3 steps that we took out of it, right? The first one is the longevity of the actual automated script. The longer that script will last for, the more benefits you'll get out of it. This has a lot more to do with if that application changes every day dramatically, the point of you writing that script is not as useful, right? The second is the test case. How easy is it to actually automate the thing? You know, if you're going to spend so much time trying to automate this incredibly complex workflow, you may want to choose to maybe use a human side to do it instead of like scripting it in the same way. And the last is, you know, just the cost, the actual cost in your business to do it. Like, how much is it costing you to write those versus doing it manually? Which, once you play all of these 3 factors into play, you can end up actually working out an equation or almost having a better sense of should you choose to automate it using scripting tools or maybe potentially have a person run through it.
It's funny because those things make sense, but the thing that people probably look at more is the cost, but that's the thing that's hard to measure. And I'd wonder, it's hard to measure because of the fact that there's a lot of other variables in there. So for example, if you have developers write automation script, it's taking time away from writing production code, but it's also meaning the context switching. So how do you measure the cost of that, right? But equally, is the cost the right thing to actually measure there? I'd be more inclined to say it would be far superior to measure the impact and the outcome of the automation script.
I know that you're very big into looking at impact right now. That's the new thing, right?
But that's probably something that's more valuable to measure than the cost of doing something is the actual impact that it's going to make.
And so I guess what is when you come down to that, we kind of been saying throughout this whole chat is really that, you know, automation in and of itself is just one way of testing, right? And when people think about it, it's not a versus situation.
It's not. It's an and.
It's an and. It's not an or.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So it's not a binary choice that you have to think about. And going 100% on either side doesn't make sense. Like, just doing everything manually is pretty impractical, but then doing it all automated is also hugely impractical. So working out your blend, your balance, your hybrid, that pretty much is the best way to look at this question of automated versus more manual forms, human forms of testing.
I think if you're striving to do one or the other, then your testing won't be good enough. The benefits that automation brings, even to assist exploratory testing, is going to dramatically enhance your exploratory testing, right? Totally. You need to be using tools and automation to assist your exploratory testing. You're always going to have expectations that you're going to have to assert as well. So it's very valuable to use automation for those checks as well, right?
Yeah.
So you need automation. But then on the flip side, if you're striving for 100% automation, then you're only going to be looking at those expectations. You're not really going to be able to look at any of those unknowns.
Yeah.
Those risks that you have to investigate, right? So you have to balance.
And so for all of the people listening to this webinar, a lot of what we've been discussing here is taken from chapter 4 of the Leading Quality book. And as we had mentioned beforehand, we had met and interviewed people from many different organizations in order to make this happen. And so as a thank you for being on this call, taking the time out of your workday, we want to give you guys a quick little present. And so for a limited time, we're going to send over to you the free ebook version of the book. And so you can jump straight into chapter 4 immediately today. In order to get that link, if you go to lqbook.co/automation webinar, or if you pull out your phone, you can, that QR code will get you straight there. This will give you a free copy of the book. Now, I also always tell people whenever I give them the book or they tell me they've got the book, is they absolutely have to download the free audio version of the book, or they can go to Audible to get the book. But it is just, writing the book was fun, but reading the book out loud was even funnier, because there is so much additional ad-lib at the start and end of every chapter that it almost tells you more than just the book tells you. So if you are too busy, you're like, hey, I don't have enough time to read this, I don't have enough time to look into this, I'd say go and get the audio version of the book. The book itself is pretty short. You can read it in a day. It was created for busy execs just like yourself. So if you go onto that link and get that book, that'd be for you. And if you wanted to contact myself, you can reach me at ronald@qaops.com. Or if you wanted to contact Dan, you're on Twitter, right?
Yep. So ping my tweet anytime or DM. I tend to follow everyone that follows me so that people can DM. So
okay, there you have it. So if you add Dan on Twitter, you'll be good to go. And so with that, I would just like to give an opportunity for us to answer some questions. So if you have a question, you can type it into the chat, or you can ping us on that email, and we will start answering some of the questions that we have here. So I have just seen a question come in via email, and it says, where do you see the future of automation going? I'm gonna hand that one to you, Dan.
So yeah, I think tools are really starting to improve. And I mentioned open source earlier. I think open source is a big part of software's future, right? I mean, automation and the exploratory side of testing, I think, is only going to become more prominent, especially as people think about moving towards DevOps and continuous integration and continuous delivery.
Yeah.
Automation plays a bigger part in that. So I think, automation is going to definitely come. It's already huge, right?
Yeah.
But I think it's going to get even bigger. My concern is that people still fall into the misconception of trying to automate everything. So I think there's an element of the future that might get worse before that gets better.
Right.
But a lot of big companies are starting to sort of overcome that misconception a lot. And these are companies that a lot of smaller companies tend to listen to.
Like emulate and follow to a certain degree.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that when we talk about automation, there is always, I wonder if there are different conversations happening in different people's minds, because automation in and of itself can happen at so many different layers of abstraction. And so, people could be talking about unit tests all the way to UI layer, right? And everything in between. So when I look at and think about the future of automation, obviously, I think there will be more smarter ways of working with automation. So we're starting to see that, yes, we've always had recorders to do click and record, but those are becoming smarter in the way that they work. I'm not saying that they are completely autonomous at this exact point in time, even though, yes, that's the vision that we all aim to get to when it comes to it would be easy if everything was completely autonomous. But the tools are becoming smarter in what they can do. And if you have more time and more data, more interesting things will happen. I was sitting talking to a data scientist the other day, and he was saying, a lot of the models of neural networks that we look at today are the same neural networks he was looking at 20 years ago. It's just that we have more data to run through. And because we have more data and data is cheaper, there is just so much more that we can begin to do. We can become more intelligent.
Yeah.
But the truth is, dealing with those testing challenges from, let's say, an event, like from my perspective as someone that runs a company in this space, is actually it's a big challenge of a technology. And so when I look at the future of automation, I think it will become easier for us to use and to interact with and play with. It'll be easier for us to identify things as we move on. And a lot of the companies that I see in the space are all focused on how can we get better at it. But then I also talk to the people who use the tools and they're like, well, it's not actually doing everything that I thought it was going to do. So once again, it's almost like when I mention things like AI, it has the same sort of choice architecture conversation as we're having with automation, right? And we've got to be very clear of what it's actually doing for us and what it's not.
Yeah.
I had another question in here, which was, do you think companies should concentrate on hiring automation engineers, or they should help upskill existing more manual-based engineers? And who do you think will be able to better understand the context of the app in test?
Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah.
I like it. So we're breaking into the roles here, right? Yeah, I think there obviously is sort of this automation engineer role. Personally, I think I like having that role within the team, especially if that person can also play a coach, right? Not just for the testers to learn about automation, but for the developers to learn about testing as well. They're kind of bridging the gap, right? I think I think the question uses the term manual tester. I don't really use that term manual anymore. For me, a tester embedded within a team is more related to the exploratory side of things, because it is different. They should still be technically proficient in using tools to assist their exploratory testing, but it's much more related to the psychology side of testing. The people side of the software, right? Mm-hmm. Not just from people building software and exploring and testing our ideas and designs and artifacts and processes and how to build software, but also the people side of using the software, those product risks perspectives that we don't have expectations for. We need to investigate them as well, right? So I would encourage the testers in the team, if this was my team, to learn more around those skills and enhancing the knowledge and skills and that psychology side of testing. But still gaining the skills and using the technology, right? Mm-hmm. And then equally, I've worked in teams where we haven't had an automation engineer, but it's been the developers that have taken on those automation tasks and paired very collaboratively with the testers that were coming from that exploratory angle. That's worked really well as well. Some of the best testing I've done in my career is pairing with a developer while they're bringing the coding skills into account and building the software, while I'm able to challenge ideas and uncover variables and bring that into the equation and use lateral critical thinking skills to think about those unknowns and those product risks and bring that to the table as part of that pairing. The amount of times that I've paired with developers, they've been like, I hadn't thought about that. And then throw your hands in the air, that's a victory, because you've prevented an assumption, you've prevented a problem in the software based on the assumption that they would make. Mm-hmm. You're actually stemming better design at that point with the information that you're uncovering from your testing at that point, right?
And we're seeing a lot more of, or at least I am, these roles that are very much coach leadership led. You were talking about, hey, there's a technical skill that people need. You're talking about there's a psychological understanding of things. One thing that I think is incredibly important is this leadership skill, which is the influence and persuasion side of how we work with people around us. Mm-hmm. And as you talk there, being able to sit there with a developer and help them understand a new perspective, the education piece, influencing the way that they're thinking, so that they then are like, oh, wait, this is really useful. I should be thinking about it this way, etc. That, I think, is just another thing to add on to that, the skill set that people should be building as they move forward. And I think tying into what you had said there, someone else had asked a question, and the question was, what I have seen is automation testing is moving to the developers, and companies are preferring to move this to the developer. Do you think this is the right approach?
So it depends on the reasoning behind that, right? And the maturity of the team when it comes to thinking of testing and quality. Now, I've worked in teams where that's worked perfectly well, but a lot of companies that do this then tend to think that they don't need that tester role. But where I've found is that there's potential knowledge gaps in the exploratory testing side with the developer, right? A lot of developers are unaware of what I've been talking about in this model with investigation, right? A lot of people that work in software as a whole might be unaware of that, right? Some testers may be unaware of that as well. Hopefully, this is where the book will help with that as well. But I think it can work, right? I've worked in teams where it's been really successful, where the developers have picked up those automation tasks and they're working very collaboratively with the testers who are doing that exploratory sort of testing task. And the understanding of each other's roles and the assisting each other and the pairing that happens within that throughout the software development lifecycle has been really beneficial and worked well. Developers are really good at writing code, and automation scripts are code, right?
Yeah.
So it feels like that would be a good move. A lot of people are pushing for the developers to also learn about the exploratory testing, so that it's kind of more like specializing generalists or generalizing specialists. That kind of model, but you have to have the maturity there for that. You have to have the knowledge of the holistic view of testing, and you have to have the skills to be able to actually investigate this. Exploratory testing is really hard, and that's where experience is a big part on. It plays a big part on how good your exploratory testing is. So you have to have that safe space for people to learn about it, grow the knowledge, grow the skills, put it into their own context, and then get good at it. Right. So that's a long journey, right? So if you don't have the strategy in place to move towards that, and the company is making decisions based on what tool vendors are saying around about automating all the things, it's never going to work.
Yeah. And I think that is a really huge note for us to end on, which is just the idea of context, right?
Yeah.
There are many things that we can do, but we have to look at the context of where our companies are in order to get there. And sometimes it is like our team's maturity, our product's maturity, the tool set maturity, the team around us maturity plays such an effect and role into what we can do that those need to be considered before we sometimes make certain decisions. And sometimes when we look at other people, what other people are doing, we don't understand where they're at in all of the maturity aspects, and we then decide to copy what they're doing. So it's like, hey, those guys over there, all their developers are doing all the testing, so therefore we should. But you don't understand what they've been through, what the maturity context inside that organization, what the training is inside that organization in order to get there.
You don't hear about that stuff.
You don't hear about any of it, right? It's hidden.
Can we take that last question, because I think that's really important, that question there around, isn't this an expensive way to do it? So I think, I'm hoping that we've got enough time for this.
we can throw it in. There are a few more questions that have come in. We won't be able to get to all of them. Let's go on that one.
I think it appears as if it's an expensive way because you're having the role of a tester still in there. You're having to do both the exploratory testing and the automation side. But with the investigation side of things, that exploratory testing, it's not just the software that you test, right? You test throughout the entire software development lifecycle, and that starts with the idea of a solution. So if you're investing that time in testing those ideas, and then you're uncovering a bunch of risks and variables that you wouldn't necessarily have had if you hadn't tested that idea, you're taking that into better design, you're taking that into better code, you're taking that into a better implementation of the software. So in the long run, you're actually saving costs, I would say, because you're enabled to proactively build quality and prevent problems, right, rather than respond to problems based on only testing software at the end, if that makes sense.
It does. And so with that, I want to say a huge thank you for taking the time, Dan, to come and talk with us. I always enjoy being able to sit down and talk with you because I know that we can keep on going for a very long time. Maybe one day we'll do like a half day. Dan and Ron sit and talk about theories on testing. But until that time, we'll have to close out. So I know there are more questions coming in. We won't be able to answer them all right now, but we'll kind of take notes of who's asked them, and we'll get some responses after all of this.
Take them to Twitter.
And that's true. And if
respond on Twitter.
Yes, we can take some of these conversations to Twitter. You had Dan's Twitter and our Twitter as well of QA Ops. And we can have some conversations ongoing. The whole point of a lot of reasons why we do this is because these are conversations that should be more broader. They should be talked about more. And so the more that we can do that, the better. I want to thank everybody listening to this webinar, whether you are listening live or you are listening to the recording, potentially at double speed. I hope you've enjoyed it. And don't forget that if you want to find out more about some of the stuff that we're doing here at Global App Testing, if you jump onto our website and sign up to our newsletter, you'll hear about all the interesting things happening in the quality world. And with that, I shall speak to you all at the next webinar. Goodbye.
Nice one. Thank you.